So again, I want to welcome everyone to the RCR Wireless News 2013 Regulatory Review webinar. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm Editor-in-Chief of RCR Wireless News. And today I'll be joined by an esteemed panel of guests to take a look at the current regulatory environment and how it pertains to the wireless industry. The general plan for today's one-hour webinar is to cover a few important topics concerning the current regulatory environment and provide an overview of some of the hot topics regulators are faced with in helping the wireless industry meet the growing demand for products and services from the wireless industry. For additional follow-up on this, we will also be releasing a report that we've done on the subject this week that will be available on the rcrwireless.com website, so take a look at that. We also, for the webinar, will be reserving the final 15 minutes of the webinar to answer a few questions submitted by those of you listening in. To send in a question, please use the question tab on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen there. Like I said, we'll try to save the last 15 minutes or so to answer some of those questions. We'll get to as many as we can there. Also, for those of you who are listening in who might have some audio difficulties, we'll try to speak as loudly as possible for the webinar, but please make sure to check your audio settings as well on that. All right, so like I said earlier, joining me today to discuss this topic is a strong cast of characters, as you can see, all with considerable backgrounds and experience in monitoring and participating in the regulatory and wireless sphere. The panel members include longtime industry analyst Roger Entner, former FCC Commissioner Harold Furchtgott-Roth, former senior attorney with the Competition Division in the FCC's Office of General Counsel, Lawrence Spiewak, and former FCC Wireless Bureau Chief Fred Campbell. So, like I said, a heady cast of characters to take on this subject. But here's a quick snapshot of RCR Wireless News for those of you not familiar with what we do. RCR Wireless has been covering the mobile space for more than 30 years, and we have lengthy history in covering the wireless ecosystem and policy matters. As I mentioned earlier, joining me on today's call is Roger Entner. Here's a quick bio of Roger. Roger's a founder of Recon Analytics, and as you can see from just this snippet of his bio, Roger is a long time and accomplished analyst following the mobile space for quite some time. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. All right. Next up, we've got Harold Furchtgott-Roth, who, as you can see, a former commissioner at the FCC and currently senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and founder and director of the Center for the Economics of the Internet. Harold is also an accomplished author and heads the Furchtgott-Roth Economic Enterprises economic consulting firm. Thanks, Harold, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Next up, also joining us is Lawrence Spiewak, who served as senior attorney with the Competition Division in the FCC's Office of General Counsel and is currently president of the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies and serves as the co-chair of the Federal Communications Bar Association's committee responsible for overseeing the Federal Communications Law Journal. Thanks, Lawrence, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And last but not least is Fred Campbell. Fred previously served as the Wireless Bureau Chief at the FCC and as a Wireless Legal Advisor to FCC Chairman Kevin Martin. Fred is currently Director of CEI's Communications Liberty and Innovation Project and is founder of FBC Enterprises, former President and CEO of the Wireless Communications Associations International, and an adjunct professor at the University of Nebraska College of Law. Thanks, Fred, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to participate with RCR. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. Well, like I said, to kick off this subject here, I thought we'd dive into, I guess, one of the major topics that has always been confronting the regulatory environment when it comes to wireless, and that is spectrum, which is kind of the lifeblood, I guess, of the industry. Carriers are constantly clamoring for more spectrum, a demand that regulators are attempting to fill. And as you can see from this kind of list of just some general topics or general concerns right now in the space, there are several issues that are kind of facing the regulatory bodies. Some of these more important than others, but I think in general, all of these very important for regulators and for the future of the wireless industry. So I thought with this, maybe we start out with maybe Roger, if you can maybe come on and just kind of give, I guess, a general overview from I guess, the outside looking in perspective, an analyst perspective on kind of where we are when it comes to spectrum and how, some of the big topics that are facing both the industry and also the regulatory environment. It's going to give us a good overview of where we're heading right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Well, I think, everybody has their heart and their mind in the right place that we need more spectrum, but, it sorely lacks in execution. When we look at the incentive auction, it's a massive undertaking, and we haven't really figured, and it's supposed to happen next year, and we haven't really seen too much. When we look at the H&J block, we've seen the rules come out in last December, but we haven't heard anything since. And it's April now, and by law the spectrum should be auctioned off this year. So that's time is getting tight, even though it's only April. The national broadband plan of getting us 500 megahertz of spectrum is a fantastic goal, but we haven't really gotten much progress out of it. So, and the ones that are, suffering from it ultimately are the consumers. It's, here we're looking at small cell spectrum for in 3.5, and the higher up you go, the smaller the cells become, and so for densification, that's actually an advantage. Whereas, you want lower spectrum for coverage, and you want higher spectrum for densification. Same when we look at, there's a lot of talk, and there was quite some hubbub recently about an article that said, like, oh, we're going to get Wi-Fi in 600 megahertz, and Wi-Fi and unlicensed, I think, should be something that's reserved for higher spectrum rather than lower because of the interference. And ultimately, when you look at here the spectrum, since the regulator and the government is not providing, with the supply of spectrum, we have M&A that's trying to solve the problem. The old AT&T T-Mobile merger was driven by a need of spectrum. When T-Mobile got left at the altar, they had to find a different bride and found it in Metro PCS, and that's clearly driven by spectrum as well. Sprint's acquisition of Clearwire is spectrum driven. So, here we see this, if the regulator cannot act and cannot supply, the market will. And the best thing that the regulator should do here is, let the market solve the problem rather if it can't do it themselves. Complicated it is by the spectrum screen that's always going around, and and it becomes quite interesting because under the spectrum screen, only half of the spectrum of Clearwire right now is being counted, and suddenly they're in play, and Sprint, after the acquisition of Clearwire, becomes the spectrum richest company in the market. And and I don't think that they ever meant that to happen. I mean that the spectrum, that it becomes so obvious that it's such an artificial instrument. And what to do with spectrum squatters. You put really tight build-out requirements there, and that will solve the problem. You either build out and put it to good use, or you lose it. And those are like my thoughts for this.
Gotcha. Great. And also want to remind those who are listening in that if you do have any questions for any of the panel members as we're going forward, please use the question tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. So, well, thanks, Roger, for kind of the overview there on some of those topics. Obviously, like you mentioned, there's quite a few there, but I definitely want to bring in the other panel members. So maybe Harold, if you're on there too. I guess obviously you've been in depth in a lot of these decision-making processes in the past, working at the FCC there. I guess maybe it'd be interesting to get your viewpoint on kind of where we are today when it comes to this issue of spectrum. I mean, obviously, the incentive auctions is a big one coming up, but I guess your general view of where we are and how the regulatory bodies are handling this issue.
Well, yes, certainly, and I certainly echo the comments that Roger made. And I think Roger framed it very well, that everyone has the best of intentions, but things are moving slowly. The National Broadband Plan, which 3 years ago framed the issue of trying to free up 500 megahertz of spectrum, which is, of course, an extremely ambitious objective, and it's interesting as a footnote to observe that the National Broadband Plan is essentially was a document of the chairman of the FCC. It was never voted on by the commission. It's not really a formal FCC document. It's just a staff study, if you will. But it's gotten a lot of attention over the years, and if you divide up the 500 megahertz, you can kind of come up with, I'll call it 3 broad areas where the spectrum would come from. One would be reallocating existing spectrum, and the Commission has already done a fair amount of this with WCS spectrum, 30 megahertz there, 20 available for mobile broadband. MSS spectrum, the light squared, again, best of intentions, but that can't be used for mobile broadband anytime soon. The dish spectrum, the S-band, so there's actually some spectrum that potentially can get used fairly soon. But you add up all of the reallocations and you're looking at something in the ballpark of 100 megahertz of spectrum, and some of that is going to get used soon, some of it not. The next big bucket of spectrum that can be freed up was transition from the federal spectrum, from the federal government use. NTIA at the Department of Commerce is working very hard on this, but there are 2 problems. One is it's going to take time to clear federal users out of spectrum, and second, it's a lot of the federal users will never be completely cleared out, and there's a new term of art called sharing of spectrum. And the spectrum will have potentially some commercial value, but it's probably going to be substantially discounted because it isn't going to be exclusive use. The third area is trying to get some of the broadcast spectrum, and the Commission has this grand, ambitious plan of a reverse auction, a forward auction. There are lots of complications, and oh, by the way, the rules haven't been written, but don't worry, it's all going to take place in 2014. I've yet to meet a person who actually seriously thinks that auction is going to take place in 2014. I certainly don't think so. I think there are a lot of challenges, and I've actually written a paper about what I think are some better ways of going about trying to free up some of that spectrum. Yeah. So I think those are the 3 big areas. So one is reallocation, roughly 100 megahertz. Second is federal government, again, something over 100, between 100 and 200 megahertz in the finals of broadcast spectrum auction, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely good insight there. And I definitely would recommend to those listening in that if you do want some more insight on a lot of these topics, all of our panel members have written some good papers on their websites on a lot of these topics, so I definitely would recommend you check those out as well. But thanks, Harold, for some of that insight there. And also remind those listening in that if you do have any questions for our panel members to please use the question tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to some of those at the end of the webinar. But next, let's bring on Larry to maybe get your views on kind of where we are on this issue. I mean, obviously, like the others have said, there's some questions about the incentive auctions and some of the grandiose plans for the National Broadband Plan. But it'd be interesting to get your view on kind of how you see where we are right now in this issue right now.
Well, thank you. And I think, to echo what Harold said and Roger said,
clearly there is, despite the best intentions, getting more spectrum into the pipeline is going to be very, very difficult. One thing that hasn't been mentioned was, I guess it came out last year, was the President's Council of Academic Advisors on Science and Technology came out with a report. The acronym is PCAST, and it's dealt with government spectrum. And in this report, it was rather shocking. They said, we are no longer going to make government spectrum available to clear into auction. It's too expensive, it's too hard, and we're going to talk about sharing. So you have a real shortage of spectrum, and when you add to the fact that you have a tremendous amount of demand for spectrum, spectrum exhaust is going to rule the day for the foreseeable future. So I think when you start talking about spectrum policy, despite efforts to free up government spectrum, despite efforts to get the broadcasters to participate in the voluntary incentive auctions, and nobody knows whether they will fully, or more importantly, broadcasters in markets where there's actually spectrum exhaust will participate. Policy is going to have to revolve around what do we do with spectrum exhaust. And so we've written several papers about this, because I think you need to sort of, from a policy standpoint, I think the fundamental question one has to ask is, first off, is that are we better off with a lot of firms with a little bit of spectrum, and that little bit of spectrum can't really do broadband very well, but it's great for voice? Or with the market shifting, are we better off with fewer firms with big blocks of spectrum, hopefully contiguous spectrum? And that's an important trade-off. And one can certainly argue that as the value of broadband is far greater than just voice, one could argue that maybe you want to be viewing at sort of, fewer firms, and therefore incumbent exclusion rules that don't make a lot of sense. Because the crux of the argument is that people keep talking about, oh, the market is highly concentrated. And yes, it is. You're going to have few numbers competition, but that is not bad. And what's significant about that is that, actually citing our papers in the FCC's most recent CMRS report, they said, yes, there is in fact no link between the number of firms and industry performance. And that's a very important and legitimate finding. So once you get over that hump, what you're still fighting over is how many chickens in the market are going to make it competitive. And that's where we have issues over spectrum caps, and we're still revisiting issues of incumbent exclusion rules. So for example, in the voluntary incentive auctions, Chairman Janikowski actually wanted to have bidder restrictions. And the legislation rejected that and said, no, but you could have rules of general applicability, which is why you have the FCC talking about spectrum caps again, or de facto spectrum caps with a spectrum screen. But here's the real issue. And again, in the face of spectrum exhaust, we did a paper last year. It was just published this month in the Federal Communications Law Journal. And we found that using standard antitrust methodology, which is Cornell methodology, that it turns out that in the face of spectrum exhaust, fewer firms rather than many firms produces lower prices and more innovation, because obviously you're not trying to ration spectrum. So this causes a lot of different thinking, because the FCC, I think particularly under this administration, has always had the one more attitude, which is we always need more. They're always searching for one more competitor. I think that's what sort of pushed through the light squared proposal. So you had the T-Mobile AT&T merger blocked, ostensibly on the ground that we need to have 4 national competitors. But that didn't resolve the spectrum exhaust problem. And I think if anything, it probably exacerbated the problem, because if in your mind you must have 4 competitors, then even though that may be an inefficient equilibrium, you now have to find enough spectrum to make sure that 4 national players can survive. So what's happening now? We're seeing a lot of secondary market transactions. And the paper we just did that was last year, I take it back, probably about November. What's happening is that firms are going, okay, fine. I am now no longer going to try to merge, because the AT&T T-Mobile merger sent a very clear message. So what am I going to try to do? I'm going to try to go out in the secondary market, and ideally I'm going to try to find low value spectrum and try to convert that to high value spectrum. Classic example of that was the MSS spectrum. And what our paper did looked at that, and you would expect that the FCC would want to do that in a rather expedited, clean fashion. But, and this is where the regulatory gamesmanship came in, and if you look at our paper, we sort of outlined all of the conditions that interveners wanted to impose as voluntary conditions that would make the spectrum completely unattractive to anybody to go out in the market and try and repurpose it. And there was everything in there from onerous build-out requirements to literally spectrum squatting, spectrum sharing. To the FCC's credit, after a year, they actually granted that petition with very minimal conditions, and they also, and I think along the same lines, you have to give them credit for the T-Mobile Metro PCS, where they did the secondary market transaction with very little commitments. But this is where we're going to be seeing where firms are going to be trying to get low value spectrum to higher value spectrum. So we're not quite sure whether or not we're going to remove a competitor, but you are going to be finding more and more, people are going to be searching out more opportunities to buy up unused spectrum or lower value spectrum and try and get more spectrum, because therein lies the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously with AT&T, when they were unable to acquire T-Mobile, they did keep pretty aggressive in going after pretty much any spectrum they could find, whether it was 2.3 or whatever it was out there. So that's a good point. You're right. It's definitely maybe not the most valuable spectrum, but spectrum at this point. So
well, they're trying to buy, for example, the spectrum that Verizon has to divest in its deal with the cable companies. Yeah. So there's an example where you're not changing market structure, but then you still have arguments over where somebody's getting too much. Yeah. Of course, the joke about that is that, but they serve more customers, and people tend to ignore that in the process. Yeah, good point. Well, great. Well, thanks, Larry, for the kind of the overview there. And also, let's bring on Fred too, Fred Campbell. Fred, let's get, I guess your view of kind of where we are at this as well. I mean, obviously the other guys have brought up some interesting points there. I guess get your view on kind of where you see where we are at this point, and perhaps where we're headed when it comes to this challenge of spectrum.
Well, I think everyone's made several good points, and to Harold's point about the timing of the auction, my experience in dealing with the 700 megahertz auction is that which was a simpler auction in the sense that the amount of spectrum was fixed, the fact that it would be cleared by a date certain. There wasn't the sort of two-sided nature, if you will, of the incentive auction. It's still difficult. Different companies look at using it for different purposes. They may want to use different technologies. And everyone has a view on how the band plan should be structured, how the auction rules should be structured to fit whatever business plans are interesting to them and the like. In this case, balancing that out gets even more difficult from the FCC's perspective, because on the one hand, if Larry's right and they believe they want to have a minimum of 4 carriers and so on, that mitigates towards having as much spectrum available as possible, because they've also recently in the AWS-4 band created the capability to do 10 megahertz channels, 10 megahertz times 2, that's 20 megahertz per, if they go with the same size block in this auction, etc. Is the amount that you need to yield tends to be high in that case, which means you need to encourage the broadcasters to participate. Yeah. And at the same time, that challenge balances with the fact that Congress has set aside some of the money to fund a nationwide public safety network, which I think is a topic you may raise later.
Yeah, hopefully get to that one, yep.
And then adding to all of that, sort of my experience with 700, where everyone has a different business plan and a different idea for the spectrum. There's also this interest in using the guard bands for unlicensed. And does that does that impact then the size of the guard bands? The statute says that needs to be determined solely on technical grounds, but my guess is there will be those, or are those, who would argue for more, in part because they'd like to see more unlicensed. From the FCC's perspective, and going to Harold's point on time, there's a lot of complexity there to resolve, and it does seem realistic that's gonna be a bit of a challenge. There are a lot of competing goals. I wanted to comment too on. I'm viewing my role here as a cleanup hitter. So I'm kind of topics that have already been discussed, based on my experience. But going to Larry's point on the exclusions and the like, but then the statute says you can't exclude any qualified bidder.
Yep.
But you can establish some spectrum aggregation limits. So when we did the 700 megahertz auction, when I was at the FCC, there were some who argued you should exclude all incumbents from participating in the auction. Going to Larry's point, hey, one more new competitor or two or three more is better. The FCC did not do that. What's interesting to note is that now some of the smaller and regional wireless providers who purchased A-block spectrum in the 700 megahertz band have said they really can't make their business plan work without access to the economies of scale of a nationwide provider.
Mm-hmm.
If that's true, I mean, on the one hand, the FCC may be tempted to, on the theory that one more is better, use their sort of general authority over spectrum aggregation and like to limit participation in the auctions. But on the other hand, if economies of scale and chips and handsets and the like are actually necessary, how do you balance that? It's almost, yes, we'd like to have a new entrant get all the spectrum, but on the other hand, if we don't have incumbents involved who can create the economies of scale, that won't work. I'm not suggesting any answers, but I do think there are a number of challenges and interrelated challenges in this incentive auction that are going to be difficult for the FCC to resolve. My experience has been, I think if you look at the history of auctions, the more market-based it is, the better. I mean, that's the point of auctions is to try to bring more of a market-based process, but they've got some unique requirements, some due to statute here and otherwise. That it's going to be a difficult one for them to resolve in a short period of time.
Yeah, good point. And obviously, with the 700 megahertz auction, that was almost like a high watermark really for the FCC. I mean, it seemed to, at least on the face of it, go off fairly smoothly. But again, things have kind of changed a little bit with the different band plans that have come since then. But in general, it seemed like it went pretty smoothly. But obviously, you worked on it, and I'm sure from behind the scenes, it was a big challenge there. And this incentive auction plan seems just to be double that kind of, if not more, of that kind of problems involved with it.
Sorry about that. And one quick point on the band plan. I actually did took me 30 minutes to give a high-level overview of why the US 700 megahertz band plan is unique. Why don't we just do the APT plan?
Yeah.
So I can't get into all that here, but that's one more complication the FCC has here.
Yeah.
This isn't an internationally harmonized band, so we're going first again. And the reason I'm mentioning this, it ties in again to that economies of scale issue and the like. On the one hand, being a first mover, like we were with 700, we have, the most widely deployed, best, at least amount of subscribers, 4G LTE networks in the world. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the first mover disadvantage is whether you're harmonized with the rest of the world who gets to learn from everything you do. And we're again in this position of, finding ourselves being the pioneer, and it makes it even more critical to try to get it right to the extent you can. Yeah,
makes sense. Well, let's move on to another topic here. Obviously, the spectrum issue is one that I think we could spend a couple of hours discussing and dissecting, but hoping to get a couple other different topics in here as well too. But again, thanks you guys for kind of the overview on that topic there. Remind those listening in that if you do have any questions for our panel members, to please feel free to use the questions tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to get to those at the end here of the webinar. The next topic, and this one I don't want to spend too much time on because obviously there are some legal things happening in this, and it's kind of maybe a bit of a challenge to talk about. But when it comes to infrastructure, the FCC has been, or was several years ago, pretty aggressive in trying to maybe clear some of the barriers in getting infrastructure built out for this. And I was hoping maybe to get, I guess, from Larry, I know you've done some work on this a bit in the past, kind of looking at the pole attachment issues and some other infrastructure issues. I guess to get maybe from Larry just a couple of minutes on your view of kind of where we are when it comes to how the government and how the regulatory bodies are handling that challenge of infrastructure. Because again, all the spectrum in the world is great, but unless you can actually do something with it when it comes to putting up a tower or a cell site, doesn't do you much good. So I guess maybe Larry, if you have maybe a couple of minutes to kind of give us your general overview of kind of where we are in this challenge right now.
Yeah, it's actually, I think I have 2 points to make here. I mean,
okay.
First off, I mean, to the FCC's credit, they have tried to pass rules to accelerate local tower siting, as they have also tried to do with just generally pole attachment, attaching, fiber or whatever to a, to utility pole. The problem is that local state governments view this as a giant revenue-making machine. And they have found ways, and I've heard plenty of anecdotal reports about this, where they're literally hiring consultants to come in to figure out exactly ways to just shake down the industry and trying to, before they can get the permission to site a tower, because it really comes down to your local municipality. Yeah. And this is a horrible, effective tax on the industry. If people claim they want universal broadband and they want, wireless coverage, but it is a real serious problem that continues to work its way through, because despite the FCC's laudable efforts in this, states are finding a way to get around this, and it continues to be litigated. I would add, my second point is that when you talk about decisions to drive investments, what to me, one of the people, you talk about what the IP transition.
Yeah.
And I was doing a debate with a couple of folks a couple of months ago, and to me, I think the IP transition in a way is very much related to the wireless industry, and that is sometimes when you're coming up with your policy priorities, you have to ask, well, what is at the top of my priority list? And given spectrum exhaust, and given the fact that local municipalities are, recalcitrant in getting more tower siting, and not only that, just building more towers. There's always an argument with spectrum exhaust. I'll just go build a whole bunch more towers. And the FCC and their National Broadband Plan looked at it and said, no, it's just ridiculously expensive. Mm-hmm. But one thing what people can do is push fiber deeper and deeper into the network, such that you can start using the small cells and the femto cells to offload traffic in a much easier, much faster way. So to me, one of the big issues about the IP transition is trying to find a way to incent investment so that actually it helps mitigate spectrum exhaust. And that's one of the things that we're looking at right now.
Got it. That makes sense. Well, and maybe Roger, maybe I could bring you in on this as well, because I know we've talked offline in the past, kind of on kind of the investment aspects of infrastructure and how it kind of is all kind of connected with more spectrum coming online. I mean, do you see the moves to kind of free up the infrastructure channel as helping to drive some of this additional investment into the market?
Yes, absolutely. But just as Larry said, that there's this disconnect about what the FCC wants and does and admirably does, and how it gets executed or slowed down or obfuscated by local governments. It's very clear, and the law is very clear that if there are the needs to provide service to Americans, that you can build a cell site. And for spurious reasons, even if they are blatantly against the law and are explicit exclusions, decisions are denied, and then it has to go through the legal channels, and in the end, after years of delays, the carrier wins. And I think if everybody would get in the same line and pull at the same end, everybody would benefit it. And the fewer regulations we could have there, the better would be the outcome for Americans who would like to use their wireless devices, and it's virtually everybody, And there's really this popular thing about complaining about there are too many cell sites, but oh my God, I have a coverage hole, and not realizing that or even when they're realizing that, one causes the other.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I've got a friend here who's involved in local government, and we've had several discussions on that topic, and he's constantly complaining about both those issues, and I try to explain to him how they're connected, but it doesn't seem to get through sometimes. So yeah, I can see what that's an ongoing issue that's a huge challenge I think going forward. So well, that's definitely, I didn't want to spend too much time on that topic because again there's a lot of stuff happening there, but I did want to kind of move on to the next one, which is was brought up earlier too, is kind of the initiative, the Firstnet Initiative. Obviously, this has been kind of an ongoing subject amongst regulators for more than a decade now, I guess. But it seems like at this point, there's, I guess, some real focus on perhaps getting something done. I know a lot of it's tied with the incentive auction, which could delay some of this. But if I'm going to maybe bring Harold back on to kind of, I guess, get your viewpoint. Obviously, Harold, you were working at the FCC as a commissioner. I'm sure you've got had a bit of a history when it comes to trying to work on a nationwide public safety network and the challenges involved in that. So maybe get your point of view on how we're progressing with this. Are we moving in the right direction? Is this finally going to happen? I guess your general view on how FirstNet is coming along.
Well, it's a tough question.
It's a loaded question.
Because I think if you were to ask anyone in the federal government over the past really 15 years, how close are we to getting a nationwide wireless infrastructure for public safety in place, everyone would say, oh, we're just a couple of years away, we're really close. And it never seems to happen. Candidly, I think it's a little bit of a national embarrassment that 12 years after 9/11, we still have, we really haven't made much progress. Everything is going on with the best of intentions. The public safety community has a lot of properly deserved political capital in Washington. I'd say particularly on Capitol Hill and with the administration, everyone is trying to help out. I have to say, I personally am skeptical that tying the fate of public safety to the success of the incentive auction is a risky place to put public safety. I'll put it that way. It's just, this is going to take a lot of time, and how it's going to play out is just really not clear. And I wish they could have come up with a better way of addressing the public safety needs of the country.
Yeah, good point. Well, maybe Fred, if you're bringing you on too as well, I guess maybe get your view on this, and maybe put you on the spot a bit. I mean, is there a better way to have handled this, or is this such a complex situation that there's always going to be some sort of compromise at some point that's not going to make everybody happy? Which I guess, what's your general view of how FirstNet's kind of come along?
Well, yeah, and I'm on the spot because of the D block, most like, given my experience with 700. And I would tend to agree with your point. I think this is an inherently complex issue.
Yeah.
The public safety in this country has typically been handled on a generally local level with state, county, municipal, police, and fire. So you've got an enormous number of jurisdictions. And there are state working groups, and there's a lot of working together, but you have that issue. You have funding issues. Different municipalities have different funding mechanisms. They comes available at different times. You've got the requirements for public safety networks, which have traditionally been more robust. They're very difficult to sort out, and this is one approach to do it. It is one of the, going to Harold's point, it is one of the issues that is going to have to be addressed by the FCC in the incentive auction that I was indicating make it a bit more complex. Because on the one hand, there has to be enough incentive for broadcasters to participate, but on the other hand, some of that revenue is intended to go to public safety, and I do think that makes it difficult. But funding a network of the scope and scale that's been envisioned for this is a difficult order as well. So it's just one of those tough issues. that, as Harold pointed out, really hasn't been resolved, and this is just one more attempt to make that happen.
Yeah, good point. Well, maybe Larry, if we can bring you on too, maybe for, I guess, maybe a final comment on this topic before we get to the Q&A part as well. I guess get your view of kind of how the Firstnet issue has kind of been played out, and whether it is the right step in the right direction, I guess.
Well, we were some of the few people that actually did when it just came to allocating the spectrum over to Firstnet, when people were thinking about it, because originally giving the problems with the D block original order, and there was a lot of talk about, let's auction it off. And I would commend anybody, if you want to read an excellent summary of why the D block auction failed. It's buried deep on the FCC's webpage, but the Inspector General at the time did an absolutely fantastic report of why the D block failed. But our argument was, in terms of giving the spectrum over, just getting the spectrum out to public safety, was that you need a decent amount of spectrum to do LTE, and in a way it's cheaper to do it now than trying to go find it 10 years later and find more spectrum. Then you can spend more money on radios to pair up the spectrum, so forth and so on. Yeah. I think Harold has hit it right on the head, where resting the primary funding for the Firstnet is going to come out of the incentive auctions is, put it politely, risky. Again, we don't know how many broadcasters are going to show up. The broadcasters get their cut both in terms of the revenue and then the reallocation costs. Yeah. But that was the deal that was cut. And there were a lot of expectations about how much the total auction could produce. And we'll have to wait and see. But that's why this auction is going to be so, and everybody I think recognizes it, how incredibly difficult it is going to be to pull it off.
Yeah, and it does seem like, too, at this point that a lot of the broadcasters are doing a lot of saber rattling when it comes to whether they want to give up their spectrum. I mean, obviously they're trying to get as much value as they can for it, but there's that challenge there too. So that could get a little tricky. I'm sure Fred has some experience with that in the past too, but that's a tricky situation dealing with broadcasters too. So
well, it's also on the FCC side. If you end up putting incumbent exclusion rules, you're going to artificially depress our auction revenues, and that's been a big topic, over the last month.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. Yeah, I mean, if you want to bring more people on board and keep out the big guys who have the deep pockets, you're right. That drives down the overall end result of the auction, at least price-wise. And the government's kind of expecting a certain amount of money to come out of those auctions. So if it doesn't come to that, then there's a lot of finger pointing, I guess, afterwards. So that becomes a bit of an issue too. So, well, guys, hey, I definitely appreciate the insight on that as well. I mean, obviously that's one of those ongoing topics, and like Harold mentioned, we've been working on it for 15 plus years now and trying to get this set up, but still working on that. So, well, at this point, I want to, I know we had another topic I wanted to get to, but maybe we'll leave that for another time. The fact that there is going to be some change coming forward in the next probably couple of weeks or months when it comes to the FCC, with Janikowski and Commissioner McDowell saying they're going to leave here soon, and obviously that could have some impact on wireless, or at least on some of these decision-making processes. Hopefully it doesn't delay too much, but we'll see what happens there, and we'll see if we have some time to get to that one later. But I do want to get to the questions coming in from those listening in. So I'll moderate some of these for our panel members. Hopefully I direct them in the right location, and if I don't, please let me know there for our panel members. But one of the questions that's come in asking about I guess the feasibility of spectrum sharing. I guess that's in connection with sharing between the industry and the government. How feasible is that? I think that was touched on a bit earlier. I think it was Harold, who brought it up, but I could be wrong. But maybe Harold, if you have some thoughts on, how feasible is it really to expect the government and industry to share spectrum?
I think it's going to happen. There are different types of sharing. There's geographic sharing, there's time sharing, there's frequency sharing, and I do think it's going to happen, but I think it will be what I would characterize as impaired spectrum that will it'll trade at a substantial discount from spectrum that isn't shared.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's kind of connected to another question as well that came in, kind of looking at, why should the government be looking at building out a separate public safety network when there are already basically LTE networks out there, coverage is growing. I mean, obviously there might need to be some help in reaching 100% geographic coverage, but would it make more sense to partner with a current company or with some of the carriers out there to look at that? And maybe, I don't know, maybe Roger, if you may have some thoughts on, does it make any sense for the government to try to take on such a big responsibility of building out its own public safety network?
Well, I think, the safety and security of Americans is not a too great responsibility for the government to take on, but that's, yep, I think, one of the key responsibilities that it has. And I think, the Firstnet approach was trying to get the private sector to build a network for public safety, and we saw very clearly the response to it, and that was deafening silence, or it was, the sounds of people running away from it. So I think, and I completely agree with Harold that it's a national embarrassment that, more than a decade after 9/11, where the deficiencies have been so glaringly made obvious, that we still haven't learned the lesson from it. Yeah. And I think in the end the government has to build it and to make us safer. I think it would be unforgivable, and it is unforgivable that, more than a decade later we haven't had anything yet.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously a lot of money spent on other ways to protect the country, and this seems like one of those. It should be on that list as well. So that's a good point there. So, well, another question that came in. Someone was asking about, I guess, the regulations when it comes to small cells. At some point, obviously, most regulations to this point have been maybe more focused on the macro cells, the traditional cell sites. But with carriers and the industry looking more and more at bringing on smaller cells to help capacity in a lot of large markets, how the government might look at maybe different regulations for that. Maybe Larry, if you've got some insight there on maybe, how does the FCC, I guess, expect to kind of meet these different needs and challenges when it comes to the small cell aspect of the future wireless networks?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of insight on that because this is all relatively new.
Yeah, true.
I've got a few thoughts I'll throw out there.
Sure, Fred.
This is Fred's probably better at this.
Okay.
I think the small cell infrastructure is different enough that there may need to be some different approaches. I'll throw out a couple of examples. Going back to your zoning example, what's the real estate for small cells? On macro cells, typically it's a tower lease that's sited often on private land, and that's kind of readily available and the like. When people look at small cell networks, they talk about putting antennas on light poles and other, municipal rights of way. Well, so now we've gotten back into that revenue raising issue with municipalities. And what do you do about that? And there's at least one small cell network I'm aware of that was delayed, the last I checked, almost 2 years because the municipality wouldn't allow it on any terms that the carrier was willing to do. Yeah. Another aspect, there's been some talk after Sandy and Direcco and the like about revisiting the idea of regulatory requirements around minimum backup times for cell sites and the like. And in the past, those kinds of discussions have said every cell site. But in a heterogeneous network, when you've got cell underlays that are small cells, yep, and you're hanging them on light poles, are you going to...
It's hard to have a generator at the bottom of a light pole,
yeah. Those are capacity plays and fill-in plays. Does it make sense to pay for a battery backup for every light pole, or an emergency just default to a macro network? I'm not even suggesting I think those regulations are necessary, but these are the kind of issues that come up. I think the different architecture would potentially require some different thinking in some areas, and the real problem is, going to Larry's point, I'm not even sure we have enough experience with all of this to know what all those issues might be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And obviously, yeah, I mean, with carriers looking to do this at a pretty rapid pace, yeah, it does seem like perhaps the government might be a little bit behind on this, or they might come out with regulations after the fact, which are always kind of tricky to kind of implement those. So that could be a bit of a challenge going forward. So good points on that. Well, another question that came in from someone, looks like a good question here on, I guess, asking to play out the scenario in which the FCC doesn't make the incentive auction deadline. Obviously, I think it sounds like from the panel members here that there is there are few of you who expect this to actually be made on time. So I guess what happens then next if they don't meet that deadline? I mean, there are some legal issues there that might come up, but maybe from Harold, I mean, maybe start with you if you want to, or if somebody else has any input on how you kind of see that part of it playing out if they don't make that deadline.
Well, actually, the statutory deadline is 10 years from the statute, which was early 2012.
Okay.
So I think they'll meet that deadline. The 2014 was just kind of an internal staff deadline almost.
Yeah.
So it isn't hard and fast, and I don't think anyone seriously thinks they're going to make it. When it happens, they're just the long list of issues they have to resolve.
Yeah.
And just to touch on some of those, there's some international coordination issues with Canada and Mexico. They have to figure out how they're actually going to conduct the auction in terms of how much spectrum is going to be available. Candidly, I think the Commission staff proposals have been just profoundly way too complicated. I've been in sessions where they presented them to a group of potential participants, and people's eyes just glaze over. It's impossible to understand what they're doing, and they're expecting companies with potential checkbooks of tens of billions of dollars to show up, and yet they're not going to tell them, well, this is how much spectrum you're going to be able to bid on, or these are the rules. You just kind of show up and hope you will like what we have to offer, because we can't tell you what's going to be available. There's just frankly a sense of unreality about how this has gone about, and someone needs to sit down and say, this is serious, this is about the last best piece of real estate, and we're going to approach this in a very serious business-like way. And until I see that, I'm not quite sure when or how this plays out.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, since this is kind of a big, I mean, again, the incentive auction is perhaps the next big tranche of spectrum coming out to the market, barring anything else that might happen. If I was to put everybody on the spot here, and feel free to make a wild guess, but I'll go through maybe the list of our panel members, and what are your thoughts of when that auction might actually happen? I mean, you could give a general rough estimate, but wouldn't mind getting, I guess, from everyone's point of view, how you eventually see that auction playing out. So maybe start with Roger. What's your general view if that auction does take place? When does it take place?
Oh boy, the lack of progress is lamentable.
Okay.
If as the other panel members said, if it happens in 14, it's a minor miracle. It's actually a major miracle. I would look more like to 15 and maybe 16, and you have to look at it also from the TV station's perspective, because there's no more spectrum coming on. At the same time, data consumption goes through the roof, so the pressure to get more spectrum, and therefore the price, has only one way to go, and that is up.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of incentive for the people who own the spectrum right now not to push down the pedal and accelerate that whole process.
Yeah.
And we'll see 15, maybe 16.
Gotcha. Well, Harold, I know you've kind of already talked a bit about this, but if you were to try to put a number on it, or even a general time frame on this, what would your view be on that?
If there's political pressure, I'd say just before the 2016 election at the absolute earliest. And that's assuming the stars lined up and they can get a lot of stuff done. And if there isn't political pressure, it's going to be after that election.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think about that. You're right. The next election cycle could impact that as well. So good point. Good point. Maybe Larry, get your prognostication on this issue.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said, and then I would add sort of the two other things. First off, nothing's going to happen until we get a new FCC chairman.
Yep.
So that's the first thing. Will it get done during Obama's second term? Probably, because I think he wants to take credit for it.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me, and I think Roger's point about easing up on the gas pedal, because the more and more we wait, the more and more valuable that spectrum is a really excellent point.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is just what's been in the news this week is that the question is, will the I still keep going back to the main question is, are the broadcasters going to participate?
Yeah.
More accurately, are the broadcasters in markets where we really need the spectrum to participate? Are they going to participate? Is in the middle of nowhere having somebody go take my spectrum when there's not a spectrum constraint? Well, great. And to me, what's really interesting, there was a couple reports this week about, which has nothing to do with, it's more of a copyright issue, was, for example, this Aereo decision.
Yeah.
It's been in the news about Fox Broadcasting threatening to become a paid TV channel. There's a lot of pressures on the broadcaster's business model.
Yeah.
And the way the law is designed, that if you don't participate, you may stop being a broadcaster for the foreseeable future. And that to me is really the interesting thing of sort of the hokey pokey of, are the broadcasters going to take that plunge, or are they not going to take that plunge? Because if the process was so much easier where you could just, the broadcaster could sell their spectrum on the secondary market and you had no problem about, FCC reallocation, all this would go away. But the way this thing is set up is everybody's got to get their pound of flesh. We got to get the budget reduction. We got to fund FirstNet and get a piece. So this is the path that we've chosen, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And maybe a final word from Fred on that too, Fred. But your general view on how this might play out. Obviously, you've got some experience in the past on how these auctions tend to move. But what's your view if you would make one on the incentive auction?
I'd say I have no idea. I don't have enough insight. Honestly, I don't have enough insight into where the FCC is, and also, again, going back to my experience with a couple auctions I was involved in, things can change midway through. A new proposal comes in. The D block proposal for public safety and the 700 megahertz auction wasn't on the table when the proceeding first started. So I'm going to stick with who knows, because I'm just not sure.
That's probably the right answer at this point. So, good point. Well, hey guys, everyone, I definitely appreciate the questions that were sent in. For some of them that we didn't get to, we will be sharing these questions with our panel members. So perhaps if they have time offline, they can respond as well. But I definitely want to thank everyone for sending those questions, and I want to thank everyone. Thank our panel members for joining us today. We're about out of time here. So thanks a lot, guys, for taking the time and providing some insights. I mean, obviously, these are topics that we could have spent a couple hours on, but I definitely appreciate you taking the time today to touch on some of these topics. And then for those of you listening in, if you're looking for some additional information on this subject, we do have a new report coming out this week looking at the regulatory environment, and so please check that out. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us today, and thanks to our panel members for participating. We definitely appreciate it.